Hi, I'm Michelle Fields. As education costs rise and the value of degrees go down, students and parents alike are looking for education alternatives. My next guest says the old education model will be replaced with one that's cheaper, sleeker, and better adapted for the information age. I'm joined by the great Glenn Reynolds, author of the new book, The New School, How the Information Age Will Save American Education from Itself. Thank you so much for joining me, Glenn.
Thanks for having me.
So you spend the first part of your book talking about sort of the history of American education. Explain to me, what is the old education model and why is it outdated? Why do we need something new?
Well, it's actually very interesting because one of the things I found out when I started looking at this stuff is that our models for education, both the K-12 model and the higher education model, were both imported from Germany in the 19th century. And, you know, 19th century Germans actually had a lot on the ball, and certainly they caused less trouble than 20th century Germans. But those models are kind of outdated in 21st century America, and I think it's time that we bring things up to date.
So tell me, what does a college or a K-12 school look like in the future?
Well, I think there's not going to be a single way that it looks. I think actually there are going to be a lot of different approaches, and I think that's actually sort of the good thing. I mean, you look at K-12 education, nobody's surprised that the food in a school cafeteria is lousy because it's prepared in big batches by people who don't care that much, and it's served to people who don't really have any choice. Well, guess what? That's how the education works too, and it's not surprising that it's kind of lousy as well. What we're seeing now is that parents who care more about their kids' education are going more and more for alternatives to the traditional model. They're going to homeschooling, they're going to online schooling, they're going to charter schools and Montessori schools, and things supplementing with things like the Khan Academy. And I think we're going to see the growth of these alternatives gradually squeezing down the old-fashioned desks in a row model of public education over the next decade or two. At the higher education level, something pretty similar is happening, actually. Tuitions have completely outpaced family income. People made up the difference with debt for a while, mostly student loan debt. Now they're realizing just how much of a burden that kind of a debt can be, and people are also looking for alternatives. They're going to community college for the first 2 years. They're going to less expensive online programs. They're substituting skilled trades or certification programs for college diplomas. And we're actually finding employers are very interested in things that actually certify that you know stuff.
Yeah, you mentioned alternative sort of routes, and that's kind of what I took. I did the community college and then went to 4 years. And, you know, you quote a magazine report that says after adjusting for financial aid, the amount families pay for college has skyrocketed 439% since 1982. And viewers can see this graph right here. It shows that tuition is outpacing inflation. And, you know, when I left community college, I went to the four-year university, and it cost about $54,000 for tuition and fees and housing, which is crazy. No one can afford that. How do we reduce the price of college?
Well, colleges are going to have to cut costs, and I've made a number of proposals on that, one of which started out as sort of a joke, but, you know, now I'm not so sure it's a joke. They've outsourced a lot of the teaching to these low-paid adjuncts who work semester to semester on a short-term contract, don't get benefits and such. Meanwhile, the number of administrators in colleges has exploded. So my suggestion was maybe we should start using adjunct administrators. And actually, every time I mention that to a group of academics, they love the idea, so maybe it's got legs. Also, you're seeing some alternative models. Southern New Hampshire University, for example, which is it is a brick-and-mortar school, but it's actually mostly online. You could get a four-year degree for about $35,000 total, and that's really not bad at all. There's also Western Governors University, which is a collection of state-supported outfits that works online, which is similarly cheap. That's going to put a lot of downward pressure on prices. And even at elite schools, you know, Georgia Tech is now offering an online master's in computer science for $7,000, which is much less than the residential regular master's version. And it's not some extension course type thing. It's, as they call it, a full-service degree. It's just as good as their regular master's.
Why isn't this more widespread? I mean, these things seem like great alternatives. Why aren't we seeing and hearing more about it?
Well, I think actually it's spreading pretty fast. When I first started writing about this stuff just a few years ago, it seemed pretty futuristic. And I submitted the manuscript for this book in June, and then I kept reading the news stories, and I would be like, no, this can't happen until the book comes out. I'm already predicting this stuff. So it's happening pretty fast, especially given that higher education is a field that usually doesn't change very fast. But MIT's into online, Harvard's into online, and lots of people are looking at ways to lower costs. So I think actually you're going to see a lot of change over the next few years.
I always hear you and read your stuff talking about the college bubble and education. And one of the things that always interests me is when you talk about the fact that colleges have no skin in the game if former students go bankrupt. You've mentioned that, quote, in ordinary credit transactions, creditors bear some risk, lend someone money that they can't pay back, and you take a loss if they go bankrupt. But colleges today get their money up front if the student can't pay it back. That's someone else's problem, mostly the students and, of course, the taxpayers. So what would student loan reform look like to you?
Well, I would try to make student loans look more like regular loans. And one of the things I do is I would make them dischargeable in bankruptcy after a certain waiting period. Because when you graduate from college, you typically don't have anything in the way of assets. 5 years, 7 years, it used to be 7 years, I think. And when they are discharged in bankruptcy, I would leave the schools that issued the degrees that got their money out up front on the hook for some of the money, 10%, 20%, something like that. And that would give schools a real incentive not to let people borrow a lot of money for degrees that aren't going to pay off.
And finally, Glenn, what advice would you give to a young person who's considering going to college today and thinking of taking a huge amount of debt? What would you tell them?
If you're thinking of taking out a huge amount of debt to go to college, my advice is don't do it. There are a few limited exceptions to that. If you're some sort of genius who can go to MIT, maybe it's worth it. But even if you get an engineering degree that has a starting salary of $100,000 a year when you get out, first of all, engineers get laid off too. Second of all, you might not actually complete it. You might flunk out, or you might get sick, or you might have some other reason why you don't finish. Right now, that student loan debt will follow you for the rest of your life, no matter what. So I think student loan debt is just best avoided. There are lots of ways to get a degree that don't cost a lot of money, and I think people should be looking at those.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Glenn. You can find Glenn on instapundit.com and pick up a copy of his books, The K-12 Implosion and the Higher Education Bubble, as well as his latest book, The New School, How the Information Age Will Save American Education from Itself. I'm Michelle Fields. Thanks so much for watching.